Throughout this season, the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra is celebrating the music and legacy of Beethoven, not only with performances of his orchestral music, but also works that were inspired by his music. On this concert, we encounter both. The program brings together a somewhat unusual composition by the master himself and a major symphony inspired by Beethoven's most famous composition. And this combination, along with the addition of a stirring work from the 20th century, makes for a program that is rich in moods, colors, and excitement. American composer George Walker had an extraordinary career that spanned 8 decades. He began at the age of 14 when he entered the prestigious Oberlin Conservatory, and he kept working all the way up to his death in 2018 at the age of 96. He received grants and awards from the Fulbright Foundation, Guggenheim, and Rockefeller Foundation, and in 1996 he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his composition Lilacs, making him the first black composer to receive that award. He was also an accomplished pianist. He performed as soloist with many of the world's leading orchestras and toured as a soloist in Europe. And he also made an indelible mark on the world of composition as a teacher, working at a number of institutions, most notably Rutgers University, where he taught for 22 years. Walker's most performed work is the Lyric for Strings. He composed it in 1946 at the age of 24. It was originally composed as the slow movement of a string quartet, and he titled it Lament. It was dedicated to his grandmother, who had died the year before. And the work often draws comparison to Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings, and it's a fitting comparison, especially seeing that both of them began life as the slow movement of a string quartet and enjoyed a whole other life as a work in arrangement for string orchestra. And when you consider the rich textures and depth of sound that you can have by having multiple players per part, and the added profundity of adding the string bass to the sonic palette, you can understand why these are so successful in their orchestral form. From the very opening, Walker's sense of drama and timing is abundantly clear. If we look at just the opening passage, we see a musical statement that is exquisitely crafted. It begins with 2 notes in the first violins that descend, and then other instruments echo and follow it. It creates a collective downward gesture as a variation of those initial 2 notes, and it's like an emotional weight that pulls down and then resonates around the space. Then the first violins repeat that gesture with elaboration, with extra notes, and the others follow in variation, but the first violins change direction and rise up, and the others follow, so the music moves toward optimism and a ray of hope. Along the way, one other element plays a perfect role in achieving tension throughout. The basses enter and sustain one long note. It remains static as the other voices move in and around it to create tension. They pull away from it. And when the basses finally do move, after holding it for so long, it's a resolution. And we hear the end of the phrase. And this gives a sense of release and relief. And it escapes the tension, but only briefly. The entire experience takes place in only the first minute of music. Throughout the movement, Walker continues to shift between lines and harmonies that evoke struggle with those that seem to shine toward hope and optimism. These shifting moods seem to be in line with the emotions we might experience at a time of loss, where uncertainty grapples with positive thoughts. One particularly poignant moment comes after so many passages comprised of lines that move independently, and the music suddenly converges into chords that pulse and pause. It might be heard as a gasp for breath, or perhaps even like a heartbeat. It's a moment of repose and reflection, perhaps of clarity. And then we return to our original journey, and after catching our musical breath, it moves on. This kind of passage recurs throughout the work to magnificent effect. Beethoven's Triple Concerto is a curious work for several reasons, not least of which is the fact that it straddles the realms of chamber music and orchestral music with surprising ease. As a concerto, it's clearly an orchestral work, but as the soloist is not an individual but an established standard chamber music ensemble, the listener is treated to the best of both worlds, so to speak. This is not the only work composed for piano trio with orchestra, but the combination is rare. This is, in fact, the only work in the standard repertoire for this combination. And the other works were composed mostly in the last 100 years, and primarily as a response to Beethoven's Triple. Now, the tradition of featuring several soloists with an orchestra is not so unusual. It has a long history. In the Baroque era, it was very common, and that continued into the classical era with Mozart's beloved Sinfonia Concertante and Brahms's Double Concerto for violin and cello, and even modern works like Samuel Barber's Capricorn Concerto for flute, oboe, and trumpet. But as a standard chamber ensemble, which has so many great scores for it, the piano trio, it holds a position of unique power when it's paired with the symphony orchestra. Consider the fact that the orchestra of the 18th century was generally comprised of high and low string instruments, plus the common addition of woodwinds, maybe even brass and timpani, to provide melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic support. Well, this piano trio is also comprised of high and low string instruments, plus the piano, a percussion instrument capable of playing melodically, but also of playing simultaneous notes in harmony. And what we might realize is that the piano trio is in fact a miniature orchestra. And Beethoven drove this point home in his own view by creating piano trio transcriptions of his first two symphonies. Whereas a typical solo instrument concerto involves interaction between the orchestra and the soloist, the triple concerto introduces opportunity for more intricate layers and relationships between the orchestra and the trio as a whole, the orchestra and the component parts of that trio, and with various permutations of the trio with itself at a more intimate level. And Beethoven mines all of these possibilities to great effect. Take, for example, a moment in the first movement where he takes us into a passage that seems like a private conversation between the violin, the cello, and the piano, where they bounce one idea after another off each other, back and forth. The orchestra is there throughout, but it functions more like a stage set or the scenery. It frames the dialogue and fortifies the drama. It has sustained notes and pulses, but that's about it. Then as the trio becomes more emphatic and reaches maximum intensity with the three players of the trio, the orchestra surges forward and carries the music over the top with its full power. In some cases, rather than use the orchestra in its full capacity as a large ensemble, Beethoven instead invites small components of the orchestra into the intimate circle of the trio to create an enhanced chamber ensemble. In the second movement, there's this divine moment where pairs of horns, clarinets, and eventually bassoons join the soloists. This subtle shift from trio to septet to nonet brings in a welcome element and warmth that's reminiscent of some of Beethoven's other works for larger chamber ensembles. Of course, we shouldn't forget that a concerto is a vehicle for demonstrating the virtuosity of the soloists, and this concerto is by no means an exception. But here we have a chance to enjoy not only the technical fireworks from the individual musicians, but also from the way they work together. In a single instrument concerto, the soloist can play blisteringly fast passages with relative freedom. But when the three musicians have to coordinate with immaculate precision, it requires a whole other level of sensitivity, discipline, and what I refer to as musicians' ESP. They have to read one another's minds and anticipate at every turn. The results are stunning. Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 4 is a superb example of a score that channels the tremendous influence of Beethoven in a variety of ways. Its grand scale, sense of unity, dramatic arc, and motivic derivation are all very Beethovenian. But Tchaikovsky also brings his personal voice, which seems to establish and push toward a more romantic, more Russian, and perhaps even more epic result. When he initially revealed his Fourth Symphony, Tchaikovsky provided a program explaining the music like a story. But programs can often pull away from the actual sounds of the composition and toward extra musical considerations. So he really struggled with this issue. In a letter to a friend, he revealed a bit more about this and the genesis of the symphony, stating that it was indeed program music, but it was also a reflection of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So it's particularly fitting that after our season opened with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it is now moving along to our second concert where we encounter Tchaikovsky's Fourth. So how are these works related? What ties them together musically and thematically? One big, obvious feature is that both begin with a forceful, stark statement that lets us know from the outset that struggle lies ahead. Legend has it that Beethoven pointed to the opening of his Fifth Symphony and said, "Fate knocks at the door." And whether or not this is true, there is no doubt that those opening four notes are portentous. Tchaikovsky was perhaps more open about his intentions, describing the opening fanfare in the horns, woodwinds, and eventually the trumpets as that fatal power that hinders the achievement of happiness. And he heightens the impact of that martial fanfare with brutal and abrupt silences. Whereas Beethoven employs that opening motive of his Fifth Symphony as the driving force for the entire first movement, really for the entire symphony, Tchaikovsky uses his fanfare to frame major sections and to remind us that fate continues to stalk the narrative to the final movement. As I said, Tchaikovsky also permeates the score with his own voice. This too is abundantly clear in the first movement, which he labels in movimento di valse, or in waltz-like movement. Many listeners are most familiar with Tchaikovsky as a composer of ballet. And indeed, his ballets are among his most beloved music, and the waltzes from those are among the favorite selections. When he composed the Fourth Symphony, he had only completed one of the three great ballets, Swan Lake, but his mastery of the form was very clear. In the first movement of the symphony, he actually goes a step beyond normal waltz to create an even deeper layer of the dance. Whereas a traditional waltz is cast in triple meter, where there are 3 beats per bar. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. In this movement, Tchaikovsky uses compound triple meter, where each of those 3 beats is further divided into 3 parts. The result might even be perceived as somewhat of a waltz within a waltz. Tchaikovsky reveals his remarkable sense of pathos in music in the second movement, where he presents a painfully beautiful melody that rises and falls in seeming conversation with itself over sparse accompaniment in plucked strings. His choice of solo oboe for this passage, it creates an exquisite sense of loneliness and melancholy. As this melody continues to pass throughout the orchestra in dialogue with rich chords from the strings, the drama climbs to even greater peaks of passion, even hope. But in the end, that loneliness returns as the melody is given in a more somber tone to the oboe's deeper, darker relative, the bassoon. The third movement of this symphony is indeed an unusual moment in the symphonic repertoire. It's marked as pizzicato ostinato, which in an ungainly translation from the Italian might be something like stubborn pluck. And that's exactly what happens. The string players have a chance to put their bows down and just pluck the strings for the entire movement. It's a delightful approach to the traditional scherzo movement of a symphony, and it brings a much welcome dose of levity at this moment. The music scampers about in this fashion until it's suddenly interrupted by a single note in the solo oboe that then gives way to a passage for woodwinds with a simple, lively tune. And that in turn morphs into a march with the brass, over which the woodwinds bring in even more flamboyant flourishes. This is classic Tchaikovskyan touch. It's finding ways to remind us that among all the turmoil, life is not all just one way, but a series of moods and encounters that create a complicated whole. In the final movement, Tchaikovsky brings together all of the joy, struggle, despair, and triumph into one place. As Beethoven did in his Fifth Symphony, Tchaikovsky's finale bursts forth in the parallel key of the opening movement. In this case, Tchaikovsky's is in F major, whereas it began in F minor, and the opening is then unambiguously exuberant. To further enhance the sense of fluctuating moods, Tchaikovsky brings in a second theme that's based on a Russian folk song, "In a Field Stood a Birch Tree." The simplicity of this tune seems to suggest some degree of innocence, but in Tchaikovsky's hand, that innocence is shaded with elements of the mysterious and maybe even the ominous. As promised, that cruel fate motive has not left us and continues to make its presence known. But fear not. Like Beethoven, Tchaikovsky refuses to leave us in despair, and the ending marches to an unequivocal victory. For much more information about the works on this concert, the composers who created them, and their historical context, please be sure to read Richard E. Rada's notes in the program booklet. Now I invite you to join us, the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra and Maestro Joseph Giunta, for our second Masterworks program of the season, Tchaikovsky's Fourth.